found out that the Milky Way is not just such a flat disk with a central bulge in the middle, but it's flat and it goes up on one side, goes down on the other. We call that a warped disk. And it's not just a warped disk, but the disk is warped, but also twisted.
Hey everyone, welcome to SwitchHubTV. It's your host, Wei and John. Today on the show, we have Professor Richard de Grijs. Richard is an internationally acclaimed astronomer, academic trainer, and public speaker. He joined Macquarie University as a professor of astrophysics and as the Associate Dean of the Faculty of Science and Engineering in 2018. He has also held prestigious research roles in the UK, USA, and China. He's also received numerous awards for his work in public engagement of science and scientific issues. Richard, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you very much. I'm fine. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for joining us. We want to start off with how and why did you get into science? That was more or less an accident, and it goes back all the way to primary school. When I was very young at primary school, I was gripped by geography, and geography was my thing, right? I really enjoyed that, and I still like that a lot these days. And at one point, I was not a very healthy young little student. At some point, I was ill and I couldn't go to school, and I missed a class during which the teacher talked about the moon. And so I was a bit miffed up. I'd missed the class, and so following on, after I recovered, I started reading about the moon and then about the stars and the sun and everything else. And at my primary school, we had a morning convocation that every morning a student could stand up and say, "Look, I've got something to share with the rest of the class." For months on end, I had something to share about astronomy and space, and I must have bored the teacher out of her mind. But that's how it actually started. And of course, as a young little boy, I wanted to be something cool. And something cool in that context was to become an astronaut. Now, obviously in the Netherlands, we did not have a space program at the time. This was the 1970s. And so my parents said, "Oh, maybe you should be a bit more realistic." So I said, "Okay, I'll be an astronomer." Not sure if that was more realistic, but that's the way it worked. It turned out I was pretty decent at doing maths and physics, and so that's what you study. First of all at secondary school and then at university, and so one thing led to the next. Wow, so it goes all the way back to a childhood story. So you're one of those rare people that knew not exactly, but knew where sort of the scope of work that they wanted to do or the area of work they wanted to do ever since they were a little kid.
Correct, yes.
At such a young age too. If I may ask, what was your journey like in pursuing astronomy and astrophysics?
Well, as I said, at secondary school, my physics and maths abilities were among my strongest topics. And so at university, that was the obvious thing to do, right? I went to university and I did physics and astronomy at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Did very well. Towards the end of my undergrad, I was looking at a research position because I enjoyed doing research with the professors that had given me some projects to do. And I was lucky enough to land the PhD job also at the same university. It didn't go so well initially. And I mean, many PhD students go through that kind of, period that it doesn't go so well. But then towards the end, things picked up. I published a number of papers and I started applying for jobs. Now, I was just thinking about this whole journey before we started this interview, realizing now I applied for between 60 and 80 jobs at the time, postdoctoral research positions. And at the time that was all done on paper, right? You had to print out your CV, print out your research plan, put it in an envelope, and your reference writers had to do the same thing. So this must have been a huge burden on my reference writers. But anyway, this worked out. Around that same time, at the end of my undergrad, at the end of my PhD, I attended the semi-annual meeting of the American Astronomical Society, which is like 3,000 people twice a year. There's a job fair and all that. And so, almost by accident again, I came across a job ad by a professor from the University of Virginia who happened to be there. I contacted him. He said, "Oh, I'm about to leave, drive back home," because this was in North Carolina, so the University of Virginia was like a 4-hour drive away. He said, "Oh, let's have a chat anyway." So we had a chat. I went home, I applied for the job, and lo and behold, I got an offer from him. And actually that set me off on my journey. Spent 3 years in the United States, University of Virginia, learned an awful lot from this person who was a leader in his field, Professor Bob O'Connell. And then I was lucky enough to get another job offer from the University of Cambridge in the UK. And again, that's because I knew the person who hired me. So it's all about making those personal connections. And so I spent about 3 years in the UK, at the University of Cambridge, and then I got my first staff position. And so, yeah, went on from there.
And I just want to go back to a particular comment you made. You said that the start of your PhD was, I guess, tricky, for want of a better word. What was that? Were you questioning whether, were you thinking, oh, I shouldn't have gone into research, I should have gone into something else? So what was it about the start of your PhD that had you really difficult for you?
So when you transition from an undergraduate degree, which takes, in my case, took 4 years, you do a number of short research projects. The longest was about a year or half a year full time, right? Then you embark on a PhD, and that is a journey that takes 4 years or longer. At least at the time, it took 4 years or longer in the Dutch system. And so I started off doing very enthusiastically reading stuff and getting data and all that. And then you still have that enormous time frame ahead of you. And so that was just a motivational issue at the time. And also the results didn't come quickly enough, at least as far as I was concerned. And so I lost a bit of motivation at that time. So my second year was a bit of a low as a PhD student. But after that, when finally, papers were coming out, research yielded results. I started to get to know other people in the community, both domestically and internationally, going through conferences, and suddenly it all picked up, and I became quite enthusiastic about what I was doing. So you have to go through that dip, and many students tend to go through a dip like that, halfway through, or perhaps early on during their PhD journey.
Right. So you mentioned a lot about your research, right? Is it all right if you can discuss what was your research about, or a brief summary of the background of your research so far and the highlights of it?
Oh, sure. So going back all the way to the PhD, I was working on a project to study the structure of galaxies like the Milky Way, but in the vertical direction. The Milky Way looks like, if you look at it from the side, it's almost like a flying saucer, a very thin plane with a bulge in the middle. And that vertical direction, the distribution of matter wasn't very well known. And my PhD supervisor was an expert in that area. So I started working on that, but it was mostly structure and not too much physics. And I was really into the physics. So when I moved on to my first postdoc position, I was lucky enough to get my hands on to some fantastic observations obtained with the Hubble Space Telescope. And the Hubble had only been launched just a few years prior to that. So this was all novel and new. And so I spent a full 3 years writing one big paper, a few small ones as well, and halfway through, but one big paper that came out based on those Hubble Space Telescope data. And that paper actually opened up the field because it was a relatively new field. The Hubble is sitting outside of the Earth's atmosphere, so it can take very, very sharp images. On Earth, we are affected by the atmosphere in the sense that the atmosphere blurs images, and so it's not very sharp. And so my research at the time opened up a whole field that caught the eye of the professor in Cambridge who hired me. And again, there I managed to expand my research and become a bit more broad. And my research really was on the formation of stars in violent environments in the universe, be that galaxies that are colliding with other galaxies, or galaxies that are undergoing bursts of star formation that we call starbursts. And so that's kind of the background of what I was doing. But I wanted to know more about that actual star formation. It turns out most stars in those environments form in clumps, which we call star clusters. And so the evolution of star clusters has been a big theme in my own research, and I'm still working on that for part of the time. Meanwhile, however, when you become more senior, you expand, you do a lot more things in terms of research. So my areas of expertise at the moment are star cluster physics, particularly young and intermediate age. That means between about, let's say 100 million years and 4 or 5 billion years old. That's kind of intermediate age. Old age in an astronomical context is more like 10 to 12 billion years. I've also branched out. I wrote a book on determining distances in the universe, because distances are among the most fundamental parameters that you can derive in astronomy. If you don't know the distance, you don't know the mass. Sometimes you don't know the age of the objects, etc. So that's why it's so fundamental. And so I've branched out into distance measurements, particularly through the use of stars that vary in brightness. These are called variable stars. There's a whole bunch of them, lots of different types. And many of them show periodic light curves. So it means that they're bright, and they get fainter, they get bright, etc. So they have a period. And that period can be related to their intrinsic brightness, or how bright they should be. You can also observe how bright they are on the sky, and the difference between how bright they should be and how bright you observe them to be is a measure of the distance to at least some of these stars. So I've branched out into that. And in the last, well, almost 6-7 years, I think, I've added to that an interest in the history of science with a particular emphasis on maritime navigation.
Yeah. Wow, that's like a huge scope of work, I guess, throughout your whole career. Most of our audience, they aren't a physics background. So I don't mean to sort of try and condense your whole years of research into one little bit, but what's the most amazing fact that you can share that you've learned in your research that someone, like myself and John, who don't have a physics background, or our audience members, most of which who won't, what's the most amazing fact that you can share that you've learned in your research that would be appreciated by common people?
Yes, no, this is a very good question. And there have been a few highlights throughout my career. And so I think I'd like to just take one of them that's actually fairly recent, a couple of years ago, with one of my former PhD students, my former Chinese PhD students. We did a study of the distances to these variable stars in our Milky Way Galaxy. And we found out that the Milky Way is not just such a flat disk with a central bulge in the middle, but it's flat and it goes up on one side, goes down on the other. We call that a warped disk. And it's not just a warped disk, but the disk is warped, but also twisted. And so that was a novel, quite a novel result. We published it in a journal called Nature Astronomy, which is one of the top journals, got a lot of press, and it became the number 60 out of about 2.8 million of altmetric papers. And so it got a lot of press and a lot of radio and some TV and all that. So in essence, what we found is that our Milky Way Galaxy looks more like a piece of chips rather than a flat disk.
Yeah, so all the physics textbooks are wrong. All the images we've seen over the years.
Some adjustments.
Yeah. So one thing I also wanted to ask, Richard, not to put you on the spot again, but some people might say, right? Some people might argue, look, Richard, you're a really smart guy. You found out, all of these things about, Milky Way formation and the structure of the Milky Way and things like that. But we have so many pressing issues here on Earth. We got climate change, we got income inequality. So what value is there in researching astronomy when there are so many problems we're trying to address here at home?
That is a question I get occasionally. And well, look, you can ask the same question to anyone who works in pure science, blue skies research, and also in the arts, right? So what we do as astronomers, first of all, we are not just researchers, we are also teachers. We teach students, and astronomy or astrophysics is part of physics. And so we teach students to have a very broad background in physics, which can be used in many different settings. In the UK, where I worked for a number of years, a lot of the physics or astrophysics graduates would become quantum analysts in the City of London. In the Netherlands, a lot of astrophysicists would go and work for the National Bureau of Statistics or the National, the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles. So graduates in our field are comfortable using numbers. They're not scared of using difficult calculations and equations, etc. So they're just broad-based physicists in general. Now, a couple of things. Granted, first of all, as an astronomer, you don't know what's going to be the output of my research. We might not know for 20 years whether what I'm doing is of any use. But if you look at what has come out of astronomy over the last century, one of the things that we're dealing with is the atmosphere. And I mentioned already, the atmosphere makes anything blurred that you look at, anything in the universe. And so we have developed technology to overcome that blurring. That's currently used by ophthalmologists. So eye doctors, eye surgeons are using technology that originated from astronomy. We all have our smartphones. Smartphones contain cameras. Cameras
electronic cameras with CCD chips. CCD chips were originally developed for astronomy because we needed very sensitive detectors. Physicists in the 1930s looked at chemical reactions between the stars. The results of that are currently being used in sniffing devices at airports for security, etc. So we don't know what comes out of blue skies research. We might not know for 30 years. So, and then finally, of course, yes, I am lucky enough to be an astronomer, to do what I really enjoy doing. That's because I work in a rich country, right? In poor countries, they might not be able to afford me as a scientist. They probably want me to work on something that's more directly relevant to society. But in the richer countries, it's also a status symbol that they can, employ people like myself and people in the arts and people in history, etc.
So Richard, do you still want to become an astronaut by any chance?
I would love to see what the Earth looks like from outside, yes, but I'm quite happy in my current job and what I'm doing. I enjoy interactions with people, particularly with students, and I think that's what I'm thriving on.
So what would you do the first thing that you become an astronaut up in space?
I think I would just, be glued to the window and look outside, because it must be so absolutely amazing to look at the Earth as this tiny little blue planet far away from you there. And that actually gives you an impression of how immense the universe is and how small we really are. And I think that's really what I'm after, to just get that feeling and then get the feeling of awe of what's out there in the universe. So just the views, that's what I'm after.
Richard, I want to spend a bit of time talking about the other part of your career, of course. You're heavily involved in raising public awareness of science and scientific issues. Why is it so important to you, and why have you dedicated so much of your time to that?
Oh, there's a number of answers to that question. And as I mentioned already, I enjoy interacting with audiences, with people, and I enjoy explaining to general audiences what science is all about. And that's also driven by two things. First of all, we are paid by the taxpayer. And so this is a way of paying back, of course. But also, I see a lot that there is so much misinformation about science in society at the moment. And so what I can do, even though perhaps I'm not working on COVID and related things, I can still talk to people and tell them how the scientific method works. Right? If very often, if there is any controversy in the media, scientists are quoted, and they're often quoted by journalists who then say, "Oh, but the scientists never have they don't say that this is the actual answer. There are so many uncertainties." Well, that's how science works, right? You never have a correct and precise answer. There's always a range. There's always an uncertainty, and the general public doesn't always understand that. So I think my role here is in reaching out and branching out, and telling people that, look, the scientific method works as such. We go step by step, and so that is actually a good thing to do also in your own daily life, to assess whether claims that are being made left, right, and center in the media and anywhere, if they actually make sense. So as one of my colleagues said the other day when we were teaching a class of students, like, okay, you get the result. The next step, engage brain.
Yeah.
Yep. So I've seen your, we've been doing a little research about your background and all that. The only thing that it intrigues me the most is that you offer workshops. Can you explain a little bit more of your offers and why you choose to offer these workshops to companies?
Right. So I've been working for a number of years with, well, at the moment with an international consultancy that does a number of different things related to academic skills training, including writing articles for publication, dealing with reviews, speaking at conferences and things like that. This particular company is called Inago, the Inago Academy, and they're international, but I'm dealing mostly with their India branch. And they've invited me on a few trips. I spent a week in Indonesia speaking at different universities. I spent a week in Malaysia doing the same thing. Again, it's interesting to do, and I think by providing academic skills training, which is really what these workshops are about, I'm giving something back to the community as well, and I'm helping students from perhaps the global south rather than wealthy developed countries. And in that context, I'm also heavily involved as a volunteer in a global development organization called INASP, which is an Oxford, UK-based charity. One part of that charity is called Author Aid, and Author Aid aims at providing support to scientists from the global south to get published in peer-reviewed journals. And so by now I've become what's called a steward, a senior advisor, and we run workshops and webinars and discussion sessions. And we try to help our colleagues from less well-developed countries to get up to speed and be part of that global community of practitioners.
Yeah, that's great work. Richard, I just want to go completely in another direction for this question. So, we have shows like, the Big Bang Theory, which have somewhat normalized science and have put the hard sciences under spotlight, and maybe even the mainstream. What's your take on it all? Not just the Big Bang Theory in particular, but it's crazy to think that, a show about 4 physicists has become one of the most successful shows of all time. And I think it's sort of a pattern we've seen in terms of shows and media out there, sort of, using science as the main driver or the main topic. What's your take on it all? What's the good? What's the bad? What's your insights there?
Yeah, so I'm in two minds about things like that. And the reason for that is following. Very often in the media, the lazy portrayal of a scientist is an old white man wearing glasses in a lab coat. That is an image I want to get rid of. Look, in my daily life, I don't wear a lab coat. Yes, I'm maybe old and white and wear my glasses, but I'm a normal guy. And so I think, and it's not just me, it's a lot of female scientists as well who are absolutely fantastic. And I think we should support their portrayal better, and they should be more part of mainstream imagery. That's one thing. The other thing that I'm a bit concerned about is that when science is covered in the media, very often it's covered as a bit geeky, and not all scientists are geeks. I mean, yes, we are dedicated. You have to be dedicated to be a scientist. You have to be interested. And yes, it's not a 9-to-5 job. You're always thinking about it, right? That's what we do as scientists. But we're not necessarily geeks. We are normal persons. We have families and children and all that as well. And so again, that is imagery that I would like to get out there. And so the Big Bang Theory in that sense is actually not a good portrayal of scientists. There are geeks, but most people are just normal people. My colleagues, most of them work 9-to-5, go home to their families. Right.
Yeah, we should definitely get rid of that stereotypical image of what science is about. So everyone's normal. I can definitely agree with you there. One thing, if I may ask, what advice, because I'm seeing a lot that you have a lot of credentials, and I would like to ask you for advice, seeing how do you get these credentials and how do you obtain them?
Look, it's a journey, right? I didn't graduate with a PhD and immediately became a professor. For me, it's a gradual journey. It's taken 20 odd years to get here, right? And there's a lot of hardships along the way. You do one step at a time. Yes, I did an undergraduate degree. I was lucky enough to get a PhD position, lucky enough to get my first postdoc, then a second postdoc, then a staff position. And so it's a journey. You gradually move on. You have to work hard because, promotions, etc., is based on your outputs and on what you've done in academia, teaching, research, and also service to the community. You have to be lucky as well, but luck can be, you can make your own luck to some extent sometimes, right? And so I've always been open to opportunities. If I see something as a possible opportunity, I consider whether it's something I could do with my background, whether it's something I might find interesting to do, and whether I would stand a chance if I were to apply for it. And that has led to unexpected things. We haven't discussed it yet, but I spent 8.5 years in China at Peking University, a top research institution, the Macquarie Institute for Astronomy and Astrophysics. It was a new institution at the time. And I kind of rolled into that through
a series of perhaps unexpected events. First of all, when I was a postdoc in the United States, I met a lovely woman who is now my wife. She's Chinese, and she works, of course, at the time she worked in the US, and then we worked in the UK. But because of that, I started to engage with Chinese colleagues. And at some point I met someone at an extended workshop. We became very good friends. And this guy is my best friend in China, and he actually got me to China for 8.5 years. And so one thing leads to the next, and people might not consider going to China. Maybe at the present time, it's something that you would think twice about because of political tensions. But at the time that I did this in 2009, 2010, it was all looking quite positive. At the time, however, the person, the senior institute director who hired me told me, he said, well, look, you're coming from a Western country. I was based in the UK. And you're coming to China, but don't see this as a dead end, because it's always possible to move on, not necessarily up, but laterally. And that's kind of what happened. You know, when I moved to Macquarie Uni, it was a bit of a promotion, but it was also a lateral move to a similar position at another institution. And so I've always been quite opportunistic. It has led to unexpected twists and turns in my career as well. For instance, within the International Astronomical Union, which is the peak body of astrophysicists around the world. I became heavily involved in astronomy for development. That led to a leadership role within my subject area, and that unexpectedly led to a leadership role in education, outreach, and heritage, which doesn't look like it's linked, but I was kind of approached, you know, are you interested in taking on this role? So the point is, you go out there, people get to know you. And the very important thing is, if you promise to do something, you should do it. And if you find out that you can't do it for some reason, notify people in time. Don't just let it lapse. So the point is, you need to build up a reputation of reliability. And so I think that's what I've been trying to do throughout my career.
Oh, that's
Richard,
awesome.
thanks for your time.
My pleasure.